Forget the gleaming skyscrapers of Riyadh or the neon lights of Neom to understand Arabia. We must travel back exactly 100 years. The year is 1925. There are no paved roads, no luxury hotels, and most importantly, not a single drop of oil has been discovered. It is a land governed by the sun, the stars, and the ancient code of the desert. But beneath this silence, a storm is brewing. Two dynasties are locked in a final struggle for the soul of the Holy Lands. Today, we step into a world of nomadic tribes and forgotten empires. This is Arabia. 1 century ago, in 1925, life in the interior of the Nejd was a masterclass in survival. This was the domain of the Bedouin. For these nomadic tribes, wealth wasn't measured in bank accounts, but in the health of their camels and the loyalty of their kin. Water was more precious than gold. A single well could be the reason for a peace treaty or a bloody feud. Their world was one of extreme hospitality and extreme hardship. Coffee was the currency of diplomacy, brewed over small fires under a canopy of stars. But while the desert tribes followed centuries-old traditions, the coastal cities were about to witness a seismic shift in power that would change the region forever. 1925 was the year the map of Arabia was rewritten in blood and shadow. For centuries, the Sharif of Mecca, a descendant of the Prophet, had ruled the holy cities of the Hejaz, but from the harsh interior, a new force was emerging, Abdulaziz ibn Saud and his fierce Equan warriors. By late 1925, the impossible happened. The ancient kingdom of the Hejaz collapsed. Jeddah fell, and the gates of Mecca and Medina opened to the house of Saud. The world watched in shock as a new power claimed the guardianship of Islam's holiest sites. It wasn't just a change of rulers, it was the birth of a unified identity. But a question remained: how would a desert kingdom, with no industry and no modern infrastructure, survive in a rapidly changing world? In 1925, performing the Hajj was not a matter of a few hours on a plane. It was an epic, often life-threatening odyssey that lasted months. Pilgrims from Indonesia, India, and North Africa would arrive at the port of Jeddah on crowded steamships, their eyes weary but filled with a divine light. Jeddah was the bride of the Red Sea, a labyrinth of coral stone buildings with intricate wooden balconies, known as rochan. But once they stepped off the boats, the real challenge began. The road from Jeddah to Mecca was a treacherous path through scorching valleys. There were no cars, only endless caravans of camels stretching as far as the eye could see. Pilgrims faced not only the blistering heat and dehydration, but also the constant threat of highway robbers. To die on the way to the holy city was considered a blessing by some, but for most, it was a test of faith that pushed the human body to its absolute limits. Imagine thousands of people, dressed in simple white robes, moving like a slow river of white through the golden dust of the Hejaz, their chants of labak echoing against the silent mountains. Mecca in 1925 was a city cradled by black granite hills, far removed from the towering hotels and malls of today. The great mosque, the Masjid al-Haram, was surrounded by ancient houses that stood just meters away from the Kaaba. There was an intimacy to the city, a sense of being in a place that time had forgotten. In Medina, the Prophet's mosque still retained its Ottoman-era elegance, with its green dome standing as a solitary sentinel over the desert. Life in these cities revolved entirely around the lunar calendar and the arrival of pilgrims. Water was the ultimate luxury. It was brought to houses in goatskin bags by water carriers known as sak. There was no electricity to light the nights. The streets were illuminated by flickering oil lamps, creating a world of deep shadows and soft amber light. It was a place where the spiritual and the physical worlds were indistinguishable. But beneath this religious devotion, the political landscape was shifting. Ibn Saud was now the master of these cities, and he had to prove to the entire Islamic world that he could keep them safe, clean, and orderly. While the cities of the Hejaz were cosmopolitan and open to the sea, the heart of the peninsula, the Nejd, a fortress of isolation. Riyadh, the ancestral home of the House of Saud, was a modest town built entirely of mud and clay. Its walls were thick, designed to keep out the raiding tribes in the suffocating heat of the desert. The Masmic fort stood as the symbol of the family's power, its heavy wooden doors still bearing the scars of past battles. Inside these mud brick palaces, life was dictated by a strict interpretation of faith and the absolute authority of the emir. There were no gardens, no flowing rivers, only the occasional oasis of date palms that provided a lifeline to the community. The economy was simple: trade in dates, livestock, and charcoal. To a modern observer, Riyadh in 1925 would have looked like a scene from the Middle Ages. Yet it was from these very mud walls that the vision of a unified Arabian state was born. Ibn Saud sat in his majlis, receiving tribal leaders, settling disputes with a mix of charisma and iron will, slowly weaving together the fractured tribes into a single fabric. Arabia may have been a desert, but it was never empty of global ambition. In 1925, the shadow of the British Empire loomed large over the peninsula. The great game was being played in the sands. Men like St. John Philby, an eccentric British officer who later converted to Islam, were becoming close advisors to Ibn Saud. The British provided subsidies and weapons, but they also watched with caution. They wanted stability for their routes to India, but they feared the rise of a powerful independent Arab state. At the same time, the first modern technologies were trickling in. The wireless telegraph, a magic box that could send messages across the dunes, was introduced. At first, many religious leaders were suspicious, calling it the work of the devil. Ibn Saud, in a brilliant move, had the Quran recited over the radio to prove that the technology could serve the faith. It was a symbolic moment. The ancient traditions of the desert were meeting the relentless march of the 20th century. The stage was set for a transformation that no one, not even the British, could have predicted. Voice over N. While the heart of Arabia was defined by the sand, its eastern shores were defined by the sea. In 1925, before the giant oil rigs occupied the horizon, the Persian Gulf was home to one of the most dangerous and poetic industries in human history: pearl diving. In towns like Dammam, and Al-Khobar, thousands of men would spend months at sea on wooden dhows. They didn't have oxygen tanks or modern gear. A diver would descend 60 feet into the dark water with nothing but a stone tied to his foot and a nose clip made of bone. They risked their lives against sharks and the crushing pressure of the deep, all for a handful of natural pearls that would eventually adorn the necks of royalty in London and Paris. It was a grueling life, fueled by rhythmic songs called Naham, which kept the men's spirits high under the relentless sun. But in 1925, a silent threat was emerging from the east. Japan had begun producing cultured pearls. To look at Arabia in 1925 is to see a society built on the unbreakable bond of the tribe. At the center of this world was the family, and at the center of the family were the women, often portrayed as invisible in history books. The Arabian women of a century ago were the silent guardians of the desert's resilience. In the Bedouin camps, while the men were away herding or protecting the borders, women were the masters of the household. They wove the intricate Saud tents from goat hair tents that could withstand the fiercest sandstorms. They were the healers, the poets, and the keepers of tribal memory. Education was almost entirely oral. Stories and laws were passed down from grandmother to grandchild under the shade of the date palms. Life was lived according to the Urfathia customary law that prioritized honor and hospitality above all else. Even the poorest tent would offer its last bit of goat milk to a traveling stranger. In the 1920s, there were no schools for girls, and very few for boys. Yet the moral and social code was so strong that it kept a vast, lawless desert in a state of remarkable order. This was a society where your word was your bond, and your lineage was your identity. By the late 1920s, a strange, mechanical roar began to echo across the dunes of the Nejd. For thousands of years, the camel had been the undisputed king of the desert. But now, it was meeting its successor, the iron camel. The first automobiles, mostly Ford Model Ts, and modified trucks arrived in the port of Jeddah. To the Bedouins, these machines were nothing short of magic. They watched in disbelief as a metal box could cover in 1 hour what a camel did in a day. Ibn Saud, always the pragmatist, immediately recognized their value. He used these early vehicles to transport his warriors and to travel between Riyadh and Mecca, drastically shortening the time needed to govern his vast, new kingdom. However, the desert was a cruel master to these early machines. There were no roads, no mechanics, and certainly no gas stations. Drivers had to be part explorers and part engineers, carrying wooden planks to place under tires when they got stuck in the soft sand. It was the beginning of the end for the traditional caravan era. The silence of the desert was being broken by the sound of progress, even if that progress was still held together by wire and sheer willpower. Despite the excitement of new machines, life for the average Arabian family in 1925 remained a brutal struggle against nature. Modern medicine was virtually non-existent. Smallpox and malaria were constant shadows, and child mortality was heartbreakingly high. This was the era of the Great Famine in some regions, where a lack of rain meant no dates and no grazing for the livestock. The kingdom was broke. The revenue from the Hajj had plummeted due to global economic depressions. Ibn Saud was ruling a nation of sand and dreams, but he had no money to build the schools or hospitals his people so desperately needed. It was this financial desperation that led to a fateful decision. In the early 1930s, the king invited American geologists to look at the rocks of the eastern province. These men, wearing sun helmets and carrying strange tools, began wandering the desert near Dammam. Most locals thought they were looking for water. Even the geologists themselves were skeptical. Many believed Arabia was geologically dead. They had no idea that beneath their dusty boots lay the largest energy reserve in the history of the world. The era of the old Arabia was in its final twilight, about to be replaced by a world of unimaginable wealth. For years, the search for oil in Arabia felt like a fool's errand. Geologists from California had drilled 6 wells, and each one was a heartbreaking failure. The kingdom was on the verge of bankruptcy. But in 1938, at a site known as Dammam No. 7, the drill bit hit something deeper than anyone had imagined. At first it was a whisper from the earth, then a roar. A black sticky fountain erupted into the desert sky. This wasn't just oil. It was a tidal wave of change that would sweep away the old world of 1925 forever. King Abdulaziz traveled across the desert to witness the miracle himself. As he watched the black gold flowing, he knew the era of the camel and the pearl was over. The wealth that followed was unlike anything the human race had ever seen. Within a generation, the children of the pearl divers would become the architects of modern cities. The isolation of the Nejd was shattered, and the desert kingdom was suddenly thrust into the center of global geopolitics. The silence of the sands was replaced by the hum of refineries and the construction of an empire. The speed of the transformation was staggering. In 1925, Riyadh was a mud brick fortress. By 1950, it was a city of concrete and glass. The Bedouin, who once navigated by the stars, were now navigating a world of international finance and industrial engineering. Schools were built where there were once only date palms. Hospitals replaced the old tents of healers. But as the oil wealth flooded in, a profound question haunted the nation. Could they modernize without losing their soul? The kingdom had to balance the relentless march of the 20th century with the ancient, sacred traditions of the desert. They kept their faith, their family bonds, and their tribal loyalty, even as their horizons expanded to include the entire planet. Today, when we look at the gleaming skyscrapers of the 21st century, we must remember that they are built on the foundations laid by those who lived in 1925, people who survived on nothing but dates, water, and an unshakable hope for a better future. The story of Arabia a century ago is a story of survival, faith, and an incredible turn of fate. It is a reminder that the world can change in the blink of an eye. From the nomadic tents of the Nejd to the centers of global power, the journey of the last 100 years has been nothing short of a miracle. But the spirit of 1925 still remains. It's in the hospitality shown to a stranger, the respect for the elder, and the deep call to prayer that echoes across the same dunes. If you enjoyed this journey back in time, please give this video a like and subscribe for more deep dives into history. And tell us in the comments, what part of this 100-year transformation surprised you the most? Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next chapter of human history.